the medieval manor and the church. The manor was the key land unit, with its lord of the manor, its manorial court and customs, and its organisation of the resources of the local area. That at Dilton lay within the administrative area of the shire and local hundred, Westbury, each with its attendant court as part of local administration and implementation of justice. In common with England as a whole, the rural population of the county made up around 90% of the overall population, and, therefore, the vast majority of the Wiltshire population in the Middle Ages lived on rural manors.
The manor was a very, very important part of rural life in the Middle Ages. It basically was the main building block of most people's lives. A manor was an area of land owned by a lord or lady of the manor who might own more than one manor. And basically those living on the manor were subject to its rules, its regulations. There would be a manor court, there would be manor rules, there would be expectations of what they could and couldn't do in the manor. And it was basically the local area that people belonged to with its rights, restrictions and regulations.
Dilton. The name of the settlement, in the form Darlington, is first recorded in 1190. By 1221, it had developed into Dalton, and first appears as Dilton in 1516. In 1236, Richard Danzy held 4.5 hides in Bratton and Dilton through his service in the army. This was clearly derived from the same land unit referred to in the Domesday Book. From later 16th century evidence, the manor was administered from a domain, or capital farm near the church.
On the manor, what's called domain land was the land that was set aside for the direct support of the lord and lady of the manor and their household. The other land in the manor was either granted out to people on what's called villein service, in which case they had to do so many days a week or so many days a month unpaid work on the domain land, or it was rented out for cash. And by the 15th century, villein land was increasingly being rented out for cash, and lords were moving away from the direct running of their domain land. But for much of the Middle Ages before the 15th century, the domain land was the land directly run for the benefit of the lord, and the work on it was done for free as part of the deal by peasants who were given land in other parts of the manor. And they hated doing it, by the way.
The manor appears to have constituted a fairly compact area of land, which included woodland, arable, meadow for hay, and downland grazing to the east on what was called, in the 16th century, Daunt's Down. Away from the small settlement later known as Old Dilton, the occupation was scattered, and suggests a settlement pattern that developed in an area of old woodland. A droveway linked the main area of the manor with this upland grazing. The winding nature of this hollow way across the manor probably indicates its origins in a trackway through former woodland.
Sometimes settlement is more scattered, smaller scale, particularly in areas of woodland. Sometimes settlement is more nucleated, more of what we'd associate with a village, particularly in areas of the chalk, which is more arable. In the case of Dilton, we're probably looking at the first model. That is, more scattered settlement in a more heavily wooded area. We're not talking about virgin forest or wildwood, but just significantly more wooded than in the high chalk. This scattered pattern of settlement will have expanded in each one of its different little areas in the Middle Ages during a process of what's called assarting. And assarting is when woodland was cut back and opened up for agriculture. So we probably need to think about the Dilton area as being an area that's increasingly being opened up for more agriculture, not for the first time, but this is increasing in the Middle Ages as these scattered settlements develop more. And the droveways are going to connect up these scattered settlements and connect them with the grazing land on the higher chalk. And further into the higher chalk, we will find more nucleated settlements further into central Wiltshire. But certainly in western Wiltshire, in the Middle Ages, we're probably looking at a rather more scattered pattern of settlement.
The Biss provided power for 2 mills by the 16th century, the Corn Mill and also the Fulling Mill by 1542 in Dilton Vale, and this almost certainly derived from medieval predecessors. A watermill is mentioned in a document of 1315. The latter may reflect the shift to rural locations for stages in cloth production witnessed from the 15th century in a number of areas.
Rivers such as the Biss were very important resources. Firstly, they gave drinking water for human beings and for animals. Crucial. But secondly, they were sources of power. For much of the Middle Ages, wind power, or water power, was the main motive force, which means that siting mills on rivers, such as the Biss, was a crucial way for the grinding of corn, for example, and also were crucial elements in the rural cloth industry as well. But certainly these corn grinding mills were often owned by the lord of the manor, and it was often a stipulation in manorial regulations that people living on the manor had to use the lord's mill, whether they liked it or not, couldn't grind their own corn, and that was a way of increasing revenue for the manor.
During the mid-13th century, intensification of the land use of the manor is evidence in assarts taking place, by which areas of woodland were cleared for agricultural purposes. Until 1322, Dilton was considered a part of the Forest of Selwood, a broad area of more heavily forested land running north-south along the Somerset-Wiltshire county border.
In the medieval period, agriculture often was based upon a series of common fields where people cooperated in the working of those fields. And in the vicinity of Dilton, the arable fields, the common fields, were named Clay Field, Great Sands and Little Sands. So it suggests that there were 3 common fields around the area of Dilton. These would be large open fields worked by people collaboratively. This is not at all unusual. The so-called 3-field system was quite common in the Midlands and central southern England. It's possible that Great Sands and Little Sands were originally 1 field, in which case we've got a 2-field system. That again is not unusual. We find 2-field systems as well as 3-field systems relatively commonly used in the medieval period. Regardless of whether the field system at Old Dilton was a 2-field system or a 3-field system, we need to remember that the main generator of wealth for much of the Middle Ages was agriculture. So the ownership of an agricultural estate, a manor, was very, very significant. At Old Dilton, the manor passed into the ownership of the monastic community at Eddington in 1380. It remained part of their portfolio of landholding until 1540, when it passed into secular ownership. This was because the monastic community at Eddington had been dissolved under Henry VIII in 1539.